I'm James Hester, and welcome to the School of Mars. Now, we're very fortunate in that all around the world there are collections of surviving arms and armor for us to visit and examine to help us get a better idea as to how these objects were made and used. But surprisingly, there's one aspect of these objects that hasn't received all that much attention up until now, and that's the signs of damage and wear on them that could have been caused from actual use in combat. This was one area that, when I did my PhD research a few years ago, that I focused on in particular, uh, that hopefully is going to be coming out soon in book form, but I didn't want to wait until that happened before I shared at least some of the interesting findings that I turned up during this research. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I focused on edged weapons, so that's swords, military-style daggers, and staff weapons, but also a few elements of armor between about the years 1350 and 1500. So some of the main questions that I was trying to answer through this research was to see if we could get a better idea of which parts of these objects were used more than others. Also, to see if there were any noticeable differences between groups of objects of differing dates, differing regions of origin, or even some factors like status of them. Do high quality, high status objects have different damage patterns from more lower status ones, which could possibly indicate differences in use and by extension differences in training. And then finally, I wanted to compare all of this information to the techniques as they're portrayed in the fencing treatises to see if there's any cases where certain techniques depicted in the treatises could be supported directly by some of the evidence that came up. So as you can see here, I visited quite a number of the big collections around the US and Europe in order to gather this group of objects. And out of those investigations, I turned up a total of 116 pieces of arms and armor that showed some sign of wear or damage from use. Now, when you think of the number of collections that I visited and the fact that I examined easily hundreds, if not thousands, of individual objects to do this study, 116 objects doesn't seem like that much. In a way, that could be a sign in and of itself of one of a number of things. One, it could be a sign that more often than not, these objects were quite well maintained in their working lives. It could also be that objects that were damaged beyond a certain point were simply disposed of, and so they don't survive today, whether they were recycled, which is what happens more often than not, or in some cases just done away with altogether. Finally, it's not impossible that a good deal of the absence of surviving damage could be the result of later collectors and caretakers, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, taking what they considered to be conservation or preservation measures that were, by our standards, very, very aggressive and much beyond the level that we would ever consider acceptable today for a centuries-year-old object. So all three of those are distinct possibilities as to why so comparatively few objects in these collections seem to show up with the kind of damage that we're talking about here. So there were two main challenges that I had to face when examining all of this data. The first was being able to distinguish damage that was likely the result of use in combat from decay or degradation that was simply the result of age, the conditions in which they were stored or deposited, or just overall neglect. So how to tell the two of these apart? That turned out over time to be, thankfully, rather easy. As you can see from this example here, so this is a blade that is in excavated condition, and you can see quite a lot of wear patterns as a result of just the material gradually breaking down. However, in the middle of all that, you see a very, very distinct notch that stands out. And thankfully, even with a lot of the weapons that I examined that were in a quite advanced state of decay, this contrast was just as stark. The second one, however, was a bit more troubling. And that is the question of how can you distinguish damage that was the result of use in combat during the object's actual working life from damage that could be the result of meddling by later collectors or caretakers. The arms and armor world is full of stories of eccentric Victorian and Edwardian collectors who, out of a genuine sense of passion for their collections, loved to strap on the kit and play knight in shining armor sometimes. The photo you see here is of one particular example. This is John Woodman Higgins, who is the founder of the sadly now closed Higgins Armory Museum in Massachusetts. And this was the first arms and armor museum that I ever worked at when I got the bug for all of this. In this photo, for example, he was so excited about wearing one of his favorite 16th century armors for this photo that he, in his haste, didn't realize that he had actually put the pauldrons, the shoulder pieces, on backwards. So this gives you an idea as just the type of collectors, maybe 100, 150 years or so ago, that we're having to deal with. So unfortunately, there is no hard and fast way to distinguish these two types of damage. As things currently stand, there's no technique or technology that enables you to date damage on metalwork. So the only way that I found to try to reduce the likelihood of later damage contaminating the data pool was to establish a sort of control group of objects. Now, these were a smaller group of objects whose some characteristic about them reduced the likelihood that they would have been meddled with later on. So in some cases, it's that these objects were in a very advanced state of decay, very fragile, or there was some aspect of their provenance where they were stored in a place such as an arsenal, where they were deposited there quite a long time ago and never left, or in some sort of collection or trophy room where they were in a single location and hadn't left that location for centuries. So the likelihood of someone pulling it off the wall and having a play about with them is quite low. So I took this smaller group of objects and compared all of the damage patterns on those to the rest of the group to see if there were any very obvious differences. And thankfully, it turned out that there weren't. So while I can't be 100% certain that some of the damage that I documented isn't more recent, I think the possibility of it throwing off the data is quite small. So at that point, I was able to proceed without having to worry about that too much. I managed to identify quite a variety of types of damage and wear, but overall they could be grouped into about 6 general categories. So the first of these are what I called angle shifts. So this is where the line, mainly on blades or the surfaces of edged weapons, where the profile very, very abruptly changes, usually for only a short bit of time before it returns back to its intended profile. The most likely cause for this type of damage is that these are areas that were subject to repeated grinding, sharpening, honing, and that over time it changed the angle just because you're focusing so much on grinding down little bits of mass on this bit of the metal. This tells us that these parts of the object received perhaps a little bit more abuse and thus needed a little bit more care than other parts. So it can be an interesting indicator of the parts that probably saw much more use than the rest. So the second is what I called rolled edges. So this isn't so much a notch or a change in the angle. It's a part where, again, on blades, the edge has been kinked or bent over to one way or the other. So there's a couple possibilities of what could cause this. One is that this is a place where the edge impacted some surface that wasn't itself edged, so that rather than making a notch, it simply turned the edge and bent it over in that area. It's also possible that this, in some circumstances, could be the result of a cut that wasn't executed with the absolute proper alignment, which caused the blade to warp and wobble enough where it left a lasting kink or divot in the blade. So the next category are obvious repairs of breaks of some sort or another. There weren't too many of these that came up in the data set, but as the one you can see here was probably the most extreme. Obviously, that is an indication of a part of the weapon that, or the armor, that at least in one instance showed an incredible amount of strain, enough for it to compromise that piece that it needed repairing. The next category of damage were triangular notches. As you can see here, this is a very, very distinct triangular shaped divot into the edge of the object. Again, mostly this was on the edges of blades. And this seems to be a pretty clear indicator that what we're seeing here is the result of edge-on-edge impact. The other geometrical notch pattern was rounded notches. So for this, there were a couple possibilities of causes for this. One could be that what we're seeing here is the result of an attempt to repair another type of notch. We see this a lot where, in order to prevent creating a weak spot in a blade, notches would be ground out in a rounded pattern to smooth it out, so that it didn't potentially cause further damage if more pressure was added to that spot later. Where this isn't the case, this is another area where I managed to find a fairly compelling case for a particular style of technique that could leave rounded notches like this. And for this, I have to give a special thanks to friend and fellow swordsman Guy Windsor, who, when I was visiting with him and going over some of this research, he proposed that he knew what might cause something like this, and proceeded to take me outside, grab a pair of sharp practice weapons that he used, hand me one, instructed me to come at him with a diagonal descending cut, and then as his response, he met the cut edge on edge, and then proceeded to wind up his blade. And when we looked at the edges after this was done, we saw that there, on my sword, there was a very, very clear bit on the blade that was slightly scooped out, that bore a really striking resemblance to a lot of the damage that I had seen on some of these original weapons. So it seems to be very possible that in some areas where we see this rounded notch, it could be a sign that some kind of winding action had taken place once two edges had met. So the final overall category includes cuts, dents, and gouges into the surface of objects. So this is an area where an edge seems to have made some kind of an impact on a non-edged surface. See a lot of this on crossguards and quillins, or the surfaces of armor, for example. And again, this seems to indicate the impact of an edge upon a non-edged surface. It can at times be possible to make some interpretations as to the possible trajectory that either the weapon that has this damage was traveling when it met with opposition, or where an opposing weapon was traveling when this weapon was put in its way. But again, this isn't something that could be done in every instance. So we really had to take it on a case-by-case basis when trying to make these interpretations. So moving on now to the objects themselves. Beginning with swords, I focused on the three main types of sword that were in use during the period that I was focusing on. So you have single-handed or arming swords, which were typically double-edged and designed to be used comfortably just with one hand. There were long swords or hand-and-a-half swords. These are slightly longer, as the name suggests. Again, double-edged symmetrical weapons that, while possible to use comfortably in one hand, were ideally designed to be used with two hands. And then finally, a group of single-edged weapons that go by loads of different names depending on where you are throughout this period. They're sometimes called falchions, or messers, or storta, or hangers. So for the purpose of my research, I grouped them all under the general term falchion. Despite the differences between these three types of sword in terms of their design features, overall, the damage patterns across them was more or less consistent. Most of the damage showed up either at the strong, which is the bottom half or third of the weapon towards the grip, or the weak, which is the top half or third closest to the tip. That damage that was concentrated towards the weak is most likely to have been from offensive actions. So these are either successfully made attacks or attacks that were somehow parried or deflected by an opponent. The damage that's concentrated more towards the strong is a little more tricky to nail down, because while it could be defensive damage, where this weapon was used to somehow deflect an incoming attack, it's also possible that it was partly offensive, where this part of the weapon was being used to bind an opposing weapon in the course of making its own attack. Furthermore, so not only do we see the same general trends of damage across the three sword types, but we also see the same general trends of damage across the different datings of the weapons, but also across the different regions, and even along the line of status. So what that suggests is that in the 150-year period that I was looking at, so from about the middle of the 14th century through to the turn of the 16th, there were not any at least noticeable changes in the way these weapons seem to have been used. And furthermore, that there doesn't seem to at least be any noticeable differences depending on whether we're dealing with a very high status object or a more munitions grade, more humbly made weapon. So let's take a look at some individual case studies now. Now, this sword is part of what's known as the Alexandria group. These are a group of about 80 swords in both public and private collections that, despite being of European make, bear Arabic inscriptions on the blades, showing that at a given point they were deposited in the Hall of Victories in Alexandria. Now, there's differing reasons why these swords made its way into the Hall of Victories. Some were diplomatic gifts from various Italian or other Mediterranean states that had regular contact with the Islamic kingdoms. In other cases, they were taken as trophies after battles and displayed as trophies of war. This particular one, according to the inscription, shows that it was deposited in the Hall of Victories in 1367, and current thinking is that it was a diplomatic gift from the Kingdom of Cyprus, which was a follow-up to a treaty that Cyprus and Alexandria had signed in 1365. And this one, unfortunately, is in a private collection, so you won't be able to track it down. But it's a good representation of other ones like it, which you can see in collections around the world. So points 1 through 3 are all rounded notches that are being concentrated by the strong, and this suggests that they were either defensive actions, meaning that each one of these notches is a result of this blade parrying an incoming attack, or it's also possible that they were the result of offensive actions, where the sword was binding some other type of weapon in the course of making an attack of its own. Now, because these notches also have rolled edges in certain directions, it allows us to possibly take an extra step and make some interpretations as to the possible actions that may have caused this. So, because of the way the edges rolled, either this edge was being held upward and impacted with another weapon that was traveling from the wielder's left-hand side, or it was being held downward and impacted from an incoming weapon traveling from the wielder's right. So points 4 through 7 are all triangular notches. The location of these being more concentrated around the weak of the blade indicates that these are very likely to have been the result of offensive actions, where this weapon was making an attack and these attacks were somehow deflected by impact with another edged weapon. So that was an arming sword, a single-handed sword. Moving on now, we have an example of a long sword, or a hand-and-a-half sword, from the late 15th century. This piece is kept in the Civic Armory in Vienna. So taking a closer look now at the damage patterns on here, the first point is a rounded notch located near the strong of the blade. So the location indicates again that it's either a defensive piece of damage as a result of a parry of some sort of an incoming attack, or if it was a bind made during an attack of its own, possibly the result of some kind of offensive action. Points 2 and 3 are located again nearish to the strong or the lower part of the middle, and these are both triangular notches. And so again, what we're seeing here are either the result of defensive actions, parries, or offensive actions if they were used to bind against an opposing weapon. Point number 4 is a combination of a kind of a jagged rounded notch while also seeming to show a shift in the angle of the blade. This combined with its location suggests that what we're seeing here is the result of offensive action and possibly repeated offensive action. The shift in the angle could indicate that we have an attempt to repair more severe damage that had been sustained on this part of the weapon as a result of successive use. And then finally, points 5 and 6 are some of the few instances we have of damage actually to the quillons, the guard. Again, like damage located towards the strong, this could be an indication either of defensive damage or offensive if it was used to bind while making an attack of its own. So finally, moving on to a nice example of a falchion, this piece, dating from the late 15th century, is exhibited at the National Museum in Copenhagen, and unfortunately my reference photo doesn't do it any justice whatsoever. This is an absolutely gorgeous piece. You can see the intentional scalloping on the blade. The hilt is inlaid with carved ivory and gilded in many places. This falchion was allegedly a gift to the Danish royal family by none other than Emperor Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor. So obviously what we're dealing with is an extremely high status object. Yet, nonetheless, despite it being as posh as it is, it's obviously still very businesslike because you can see there's quite a number of bits of damage to it. Point number 1 is a series of 5 very small cuts that dig into the edge towards the lower part of the strong. So again, given its location, we're looking at either purely defensive damage as a result of some kind of parry or deflection, or offensive damage if it was combined with an attack while this was binding an opposing weapon. Points 2 through 4, you can see are rounded notches that have a slight roll to the edge on one side. So 2 and 3 are likely as a result of these rolled edges, indicating that we have two edges that met slightly off angle. And point number 4, because of its shape, could be the result, as we had discussed before, of some kind of winding action happening while the two edges were engaged. Point number 5 is a simple rolled edge. Again, its location indicates that this was probably from an offensive action. And then finally, point 6 is a rounded notch with an edge rolled in one particular area. Again, given its location, we're probably looking at offensive action where this attack was set aside by an incoming weapon, and possibly, given the shape, it could have been some winding of one or both of the blades at this point of impact. So, how does all of this information compare to what we see depicted in the fencing treatises? Well, it turns out that there are quite a number of parallels, and there's quite a lot that's supported here. So, looking at some actions with single-handed sword use, we see this depiction from the Getty copy of Fiore de Libri's early 15th century treatise, and next to that we have the Munich copy of Hans Talhofer's later 15th century, 1467 to be exact, fight book, where we see the lower part being the centers of activity here, which matches up quite nicely to some of the damage patterns that we see depicted. So with longswords, we see quite a lot of matches as well. The two illustrations here not only show plenty of activity centered around the lower part of the strong, but also a couple of instances where the quillons, or the hilt, is used both offensively, as you see with the Talhofer illustration, but also defensively, as you see with the Fiore one, which could account for some of the damage that we've seen to the quillons. And finally, moving on to falchions, again we see a pretty good match between the treatises and the damage on the objects. You have the illustration from Talhofer here again, showing the upper part of the blade being used to attack, and their opponent parrying with the middle to lower part. And then finally on the right, the illustration from Kunz Ritterliche Wehr from the later 15th century, showing a bind with the strong of the blade, while at the same time trying to execute an attack with the weak. So again, showing another possible scenario that could account for some of the damage to the strong that's more offensive in nature than defensive. So very exciting for swords in particular. There were a couple specific types of techniques or principles that the damage on the objects lent more weight to. One of these is the use of the false edge. Now, this is something that's depicted quite a lot in the fencing treatises, and it's unfortunately difficult to nail down in the majority of swords because most of the weapons are symmetrical, where there's nothing about the object that indicates a designated way in which it was held, where you would have the same edges be the designated true and false edges at all times. However, there were a smaller number of objects where some design feature, whether it was characteristic of the way the hilt was built or some decorative feature, in some cases there's decoration only on one side and not the other, which indicates that that would be the side that would be outward, so that dictates the way it was worn, and by extension, which way it would be drawn and used at all times. So in these few cases, it did become possible to designate the standard true edge and standard false edge as they'd be used for at least most of the time. And so for these few identifiable true and false edges, sure enough, we do see damage on both edges. And this matches up quite nicely to false edge techniques as they are described in the treatises, both in defensive situations and in offensive situations. And more interestingly, this damage shows up across the full range of statuses within these weapons. They show up in very, very elaborate high status weapons, but also in more munitions grade common weapons as well. So it suggests that the use of the false edge wasn't a terribly highbrow learned technique, but it was something that was appreciated and indeed used right the way down across the status chain, from very, very high status individuals who would have received specialized training, right the way down to your more run-of-the-mill soldiers who might not have received as much specialist training but were just picking things up as they went along. So another principle that was reinforced quite a bit from the information that I gathered was the idea of the center of percussion. So the center of percussion is essentially the sweet spot on any sword that if you manage to land a blow on this spot, there's no energy wasted from the weapon jarring forward or back. It all is behind you simply passing straight through the cut. So it's the most efficient place to cut with on a sword. There are ways to determine exactly where this is on a sword, but you need some fairly sophisticated devices in order to get the precise measurement. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring all of that with me when I would go on these visits, so I had to rely on a slightly more rough and ready approach, which was to do what a friend of mine calls the wobble test, where if you take a sword and hold it very, very loosely in your hand with the blade facing up, and you allow it to make very, very light fluid circles like this, there'll be a single point on the blade that is more or less stationary while the whole rest of the sword above and below kind of moves around that spot. And that spot is more or less where the center of percussion is. It's not precise, but it was better than nothing in being able to approximate something where I didn't have the right equipment. So, not surprisingly, there weren't all that many curators and caretakers of these collections that were happy with me taking 600-700-year-old weapons and wobbling them around like this. So I wasn't able to get that measurement for all of the weapons that I examined. However, I did get permission from some, so I was able to get this measurement in at least a smaller group of them. So for those that I was able to identify the center of percussion, a surprisingly large number of them did in fact have damage clustered around this point, on both edges even in some cases. So while this doesn't necessarily indicate that the users of these weapons had a precise scientific understanding of the principle behind the center of percussion, it does suggest that at the very least practitioners at the time had some kind of intuitive understanding of this. If you manage to land your blows with this part of the blade, it feels a lot better and you cut a lot cleaner. It does seem to indicate that there was some appreciation of that fact. There were 4 main types of daggers that I examined during this study. The first are what are known as rondel daggers, and this name comes from the discs that are essentially form either end of the grip, usually around the guard, and where essentially there would be a pommel. Now, this is the most commonly depicted dagger in the fencing treatises, and it is largely considered to be primarily a military-style dagger. The other common style are what are known as bollock daggers or bollock knives. This is a reference to the rather phallic-shaped hilt that a lot of them tend to have. A few examples were 2 other styles. One was a style of, you could either call it a longish dagger or a shortish sword, known as a bacillard. The greatest characteristic of these styles of dagger were its kind of eye-shaped hilt, And these were very common throughout the late Middle Ages as a standard sidearm. And then finally, a small handful of daggers are of a style generically referred to as quillen daggers. So these are daggers that have a standard kind of cross hilt, not dissimilar from that of a sword, but just in miniature. So despite these different styles, there was no noticeable difference in the damage patterns between the styles. So even though there might be slightly different features design-wise of all of these daggers, as far as the damage patterns are concerned, they can be treated more or less the same, which could suggest that even though the stylistic differences might be quite extreme to look at them, it does suggest that they may have actually all been used more or less in the same manner. On daggers, damage was restricted exclusively to the blade, mainly concentrated along the middle and the strong. There were particularly large numbers of angle shifts, however, present both at the strong and at the weak. So the majority of damage at the weak were angle shifts. So this, as I discussed before, is an indication that these areas on a lot of these daggers were the points of greatest abuse, where the most action was taking place. So let's look at a specific example of one of these daggers. So this is a very nicely preserved Balak dagger in the Museum of London. It's dated to between the late 15th and early 16th century, and it's very similar in style to some of the daggers recovered from the Mary Rose. There's quite a lot of damage on this piece. Points 1 through 3 are the damage bits on the edge, and these are all triangular notches. So this indicates that the actions that caused these points of damage were edge-on-edge contact. For the remaining ones, points 4 through 6 on the back, if we interpret the way this would have been held by the way in which daggers are commonly held in the fencing treatises, that is, in a reverse grip with the blade extending downward, with the edge facing outward, then points 4 and 5 are on the right side corner of the back edge, and these are cuts into the surface, and point 6 is on the left side. And again, it's another cut. Now, all three of these, given their location and the type of damage that they are either the result of parries by the wielder of this dagger, or of the wielder making a series of attacks that were parried by an opposing target. Now, all of these contact points match up fairly well with some of the techniques that we see depicted in the fencing treatises. As you can see here, we have an illustration of a dagger being used to parry an incoming cut in the Getty version of Fiore's treatise. And then on the right, we have a two-handed parry with a dagger against another incoming thrust from a dagger in Filippo Vadi's treatise from the 1480s. Because there are comparatively few strikes and slashes with daggers depicted in the fencing treatises, it's entirely possible that most of the damage that we're seeing on these daggers is defensive in nature. The treatises also depict quite often parries with daggers being used either with the flat or the back edge, the blunt spine of the dagger. So if we take that into consideration, then it's very likely that any damage we see on these daggers to this area is probably defensive in nature. That in this case, that reinforced thicker back edge was being used to beat away incoming attacks. So moving on now to staff weapons. There were four main types of staff weapons that I focused on for this research. So the four types that I looked at were halberds, bills, glaives, and then finally poleaxes. Looking at each of these individually, for halberds, most of the damage that I encountered was focused on either the upper part of the main cutting edge, the axe head, and also the top spike, the thrusting point. Some isolated instances of damage were also found unusually at the top of the axe head, the kind of point where the axe head usually progresses, where it meets up with the top spike, the thrusting point. It's possible that what we're seeing in those areas is damage as the result of defensive actions, where that bit is used to parry or block an incoming attack. For bills, most of the damage was on the lower part of the main cutting edge of the head, and also the inside of the topmost hook that comes down from the front. For the lower part of the cutting head, we're probably seeing there the result of strike actions. And for the inside of the top hook, we're probably seeing there the result of strikes or the use of that area to bind or trap some other opposing weapon. Also with bills, like with halberds, we see some damage to the top spike, the main thrusting point as well. For glaives, most of the damage is restricted to the top and back of the main head, the cutting edge, but also there's some damage around the socket where the head, the metal head, meets the staff. So for those parts in particular, what we're probably seeing is the result of damage from deflecting or parrying incoming attacks. And then finally, for poleaxes, while there is some damage to the main axe head, the vast majority of the damage that I found was exclusively at the top spike, the thrusting point. So looking at some examples now of some of these staff weapons, here we have a nice turn of the 16th century halberd in the German History Museum in Berlin. This one has two instances of damage. The first one is a rounded notch that's on that top part of the axe head that I'd mentioned before, the point where it gradually meets up with the top spike. And the second instance of damage is a triangular notch. It's on the upper part of the axe head. This, given its location, is probably the result of some kind of offensive action that either successfully struck its target and caused a bit of a rolled edge because of the surface that it landed on, or where this attack was set aside at that point of impact with an opposing weapon. And then finally we have this lovely late 15th century poleaxe at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. Sadly, last time I checked, it's not on display. And there's a handful of damage points on this piece. The first one is a small rounded notch, which is on the lower part of the axe head. And given the location, this is probably the result of an offensive action that was either set aside at this point or managed to strike a surface there and was later maintained into that rounder notch in order to prevent it becoming a weak spot. Points 2 and 3 are actually on the beak, the back spike that comes off on the back of the head. And these are probably defensive marks, where this spot was used either to directly block, like a static parry, or to beat aside an incoming attack. Points 4 through 6 are cuts and rounded notches that are on either side of the top spike coming out from the top of the head. And given the location towards the lower part of this, these were probably attempted thrusts by the wielder, which were parried by the opposing target. And then finally, most interestingly, points 7 through 11 are a series of cuts along the brasswork of the langet which is the metal strips that extend down the staff in order to provide extra protection against the to the wooden staff. In many of these cases, these individual cuts carry on across several strips of the brass, so you can really see where a single blow landed right across the langets and left an impression across several of the strips all at one point. And so there are several instances of this on this part. So these are almost certainly defensive. So how does this all match up to the unfortunately quite sparse coverage of staff weapons for the most part in the fencing treatises? Obviously the poleaxe gets the most attention in the fencing treatises compared to most other styles of staff weapon. Thankfully, we have a potential cheat for this in the form of a passage from Pietramonte's turn of the 16th century treatise Collectanea, where he states quite outright that in his opinions all staff weapons should be used in the manner of the poleaxe. So if we take him at his word on that, then we can take a lot of the depictions of poleaxe use in the treatises and apply it to the other styles of staff weapons to see if we have overlap. And for a lot of the characteristics, we actually do. There's quite a lot of common features in terms of damage points across the staff weapons, even though there's quite a lot of stylistic differences between them. So that could be an indication that you have quite common trends of use across these different styles, as Monte advised. With the poleaxe in particular, this is particularly interesting because Monte also in another section talks about how the edge of a staff weapon, he's specifically talking about the poleaxe, the edge of the poleaxe is all well and good for use in a tournament setting, but for real earnest battle, your best bet is to use the top spike and use the poleaxe almost exclusively as a thrusting weapon. So this is quite interesting because if we take that to heart, then suddenly the large concentration of damage to the top spike, not just on the poleaxes, but also across many of the other styles of staff weapon, starts to make more sense. So we start to see this principle actually possibly having been understood and appreciated quite widely across users of these weapons at the time. And more interestingly, we have, from a slightly later post-period of focus for this study treatise, that of Joachim Myers from 1570, an actual depiction of just the sort of parry with the top section of a halberd, as I had discussed earlier. So it's quite exciting, even though it's from a treatise that postdates this area of study. It does suggest that this was a manner of using the halberd that was probably quite well understood for the extent of time that the halberd was in use. So I think it's safe to be able to take this technique and bring it back to the period of the halberds that we examined, these late medieval pieces. So the last category of objects that I examined for damage were pieces of armor. Surprisingly, very, very little armor in the collections I visited were found with any really obvious telltale signs of damage like what I was looking for. This could be an indication that a lot of this armor was very well maintained during its working life, that any signs of damage were very quickly repaired so as to make sure that it was constantly in tip-top condition. However, it's also not impossible that we're dealing with a lot more rigorous and aggressive conservation of these objects later in their lives when they were in the hands of early collectors in order to make sure that they looked prettier. Finally, it's also entirely possible that the comparative lack of damage is a testament to how well these items were constructed. Good armor was designed to be deflection surfaces, not to take direct on abuse, but rather the shapes were designed to cause incoming attacks to glance off. And so unless an attack managed to actually gain good purchase, it's not going to leave a very obvious mark, or at least not something that couldn't very quickly and easily be buffed off. So all three of these could be explanations as to why there's so little wear damage from use on surviving armor. The majority of pieces of armor that I examined were helmets, and the three main types that I examined for this were bassinets from the kind of later 14th through the early parts of the 15th century, sallets through the later part of the 15th century, and on one particular occasion, a more munitions grade skull cap, again from the mid to late 15th century. Now, for helmets, most of the damage was found on the right side of the skull and along the sights, the eye slits. All but a few instances of these damage were cuts, and so these seem to be the result of strikes to these surfaces. On the single breastplate that I examined, there were two instances of damage, and these were notches, one located around the left armpit and the other around the left side of the collar. Now, it's possible that what we're seeing here is the result of attempted thrusts into these parts of the armor, because obviously these will lead into vulnerable areas. So these could be attempts to bypass the breastplate and get into the more vulnerable open areas of the wearer. For the single leg harness that I examined, there was one very interesting piece of damage that was located on the fan plate of the polling, the part covering the knee, which was a rolled edge along this area. And because it's so interesting, I'm going to go into this a little more detail in a little bit. And then finally, the damage to the arm harness pieces that I examined were largely restricted to the pauldrons, the shoulder areas, the areas below the cooter or the elbow, and in one area it was to the area that would be around the bessicule, which was designed to protect the armpit. These were all cuts, and so probably what we're seeing there is the result again of attempted strikes to these areas. So let's take a look at some specific examples now. So this is a turn of the 15th century bassinet, either French or Italian, in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. It has a fascinating piece of damage, which is a cut which extends vertically across both ridges of the right sight. And so this seems to be a telltale indication that this helmet suffered a single, more or less vertical strike that came down and landed right on the visor in this spot. And moving on now to the leg harness that I discussed earlier. This is a 15th century piece, late 15th century, also in the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. The single rolled edge is located on the fan plate, which is the large plate that extends out from the pollen, the knee defense. And it's a fairly clear indication that there was a strike to this area that the fan plate successfully defended against. These two illustrations here, the first from Fiore's treatise in the Getty Museum, and the second from the Berlin copy of Talhofer's fight book from the mid to late 15th century, shows some examples that could be equivalents to some of the damage we had just seen on the two pieces that we discussed. So what does all this information tell us? Well, first off, unfortunately, there's a few things that the data can't tell us. Unfortunately, we can't tell whether or not the damage that we're seeing on these objects is the result of combat on foot or on horseback. Likewise, we can't tell whether or not the damage on the weapons is the result of attacks against armored or unarmored opponents. Finally, while we could make some very, very general interpretations as to types of techniques such as the trajectory by which the weapons were traveling at the time of impact, We can't get very specific in most cases as to specific types of techniques that were being used to cause these instances of damage. We just don't have enough details from what's here to draw those conclusions with any certainty. There is, however, quite a lot that we have gained from all of this research. First off, we now have a common typology of styles and characteristics of damage on arms and armor. So if other people go forward and do some of this similar research, and I hope that they do, we have a common language with how we can describe the various damage bits that we find on objects. We also have seen that whether it's differences in the date of objects, whether it's differences in the region that these objects originate from, or even the perceived status of these objects, and by extension the users of these objects, there's no noticeable difference in the damage patterns on the objects themselves. So this suggests that within the 150-year period covered by this study, we don't see a massive shift in the way in which these weapons were used, and that pairs up pretty well with the similarity in style throughout that same period in the fencing treatises. It also suggests that any perceived national difference in styles, or at least difference in masters of different regional origins, is at best aesthetic. These masters may have unique features to their particular style of combat, but these styles are not so distinctive that the practice of them shows up in a distinctive way on the weapons of the people practicing those styles. And finally, the similarity across the status lines suggests that even if high-status individuals had access to specialized martial training, either this training is not so distinctive as to show up in a distinctive way on the weapons, or regardless of whether you're a specially trained martial artist or somebody who has just picked things up as they went along and knows what works and what doesn't, perhaps all of these individuals, when everything was really in the thick of it, relied more or less on the same techniques. And a lot of these very, very specialized techniques didn't really see a lot of practice on the field of battle. You stuck with the cheap and cheerful, tried and true pieces that worked, and saved the rest for the Saal. All of this information also seems to suggest that, contrary to certain schools of thought, we have seen a lot more edge-on-edge impact as opposed to edge-on-flat impact, as is put forward by certain schools of interpretation. If there was more of a practice of edge-to-flat contact, as some suggest, you would expect to see a lot more damage to this area, even if it was faint, because, of course, an edge wouldn't necessarily always leave very, very strong impacts on a flat, but you would still see some. And so the fact that we see so little of this shows that while the flat was used in some circumstances, by and large, if you were going to meet an incoming edged weapon, you would most likely do so with your own edge as opposed to the flat in most circumstances. So finally, one interesting side effect of this research was that on several occasions I examined swords that had long been identified as being ceremonial, being used either for processions or some other kind of ritual purpose, that when I looked closer at them, sure enough, the blades actually exhibited some damage. So that opens up this whole can of worms as to why alleged ceremonial weapons could have damage consistent with them having at one point actually been used. But that's a story for another day, so I think I'm going to make another talk looking specifically at that, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I hope you found this very useful and interesting. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me either on Patreon, which is patreon.com/School of Mars. If you're watching this via Patreon, then hearty thanks to you, my patrons, for all of your support. You can also contact me either by Facebook, if you look up the School of Mars, or on the website schoolofmars.com. Thank you all for your attention and your continued support, and I'll see you next time.